All right, let's talk shifter kart engines. Let's say you're getting into shifter karting and you're a little bit overwhelmed with the different options available in the USA market. This will be an excellent video going into the details of each. We have the Japanese engines depicted here by the Honda, which the Japanese MOTO engines, which MOTO is short for motocross. Honda and Yamaha are the available options today, although the Honda is no longer made, so the Honda is only used stuff. Then we have the three Italian engines, Italian-made engines. The Vortex ROK shifter, which is a spec engine. The KZ engines, which is depicted by a TM. There's 4 other KZ brands out there: Modena, IAME, Vortex, and Italian Motors. And then we have in the USA market the IAME Super Shifter 175. These 3 engines have similar build characteristics where they have a pipe and silencer out the back and an air intake that goes out the front, which is a 2-piece split air box with a proper air filter in between. The Vortex ROK shifter has an air box like so that does not have any type of integral filter, and there is a filter sock that you could buy from IAME. It's an IAME product that you can put in there, but you will go slower if you want to run this locally. I highly recommend, just for practice so you're not sucking up all the track grit into this engine, to buy that filter sock or just to buy a proper air box for it. And of course this engine has the pipe out the front, like a traditional motocross engine, and a carburetor and air filter out the back. The engine weights, these 3 are very close, within 1 pound. There's rumors out there that this engine is heavy, boat anchor, oversized, whatnot. They're all almost identically sized and weight, within 1 pound of each other. This one might sit a little bit taller on the kart because it has a taller engine mount. It has a more angled engine mount, and it also has a cylinder spacer here because this uses a little bit longer rod. So it has a little bit of a higher appearance, although without those things, they're all pretty much the same height and also the same weight. This engine is about 5 pounds lighter than the other engines as well. So just know that. The cost new. This engine, all in all together, I believe is going to be, for the Yamaha, you can't get a Honda new, it's going to be around the mid-4s. This engine is $4,300 new, but you also need to buy a few of the little trinkets for it. You need to buy the J-arm extension, the fuel pump mount. I highly recommend getting a proper air box for it. The silencer, like I showed you before, does not have a proper, or should I say a modern downturn in it so that you don't melt the bumper. So you have to buy a deflector for it. You have to buy that for this one as well. So all in all, you're probably going to be around $4,500 after you buy all those things just to go run this for your local practice. And also I want to mention that the entire context of this video is for the guy looking to get into the sport. Whether that's just to go be a recreational hobbyist or maybe to be first year racing local regional stuff. This engine is $4,300 new for the standard edition TM-R2. It comes with a proper silencer with the downturn. That's the one I just showed you. But there are a few things you need to buy for it as well. It does not come with an airbox at all. It doesn't come with a fuel pump mount. So all in all, you'd be around $4,500 in for this one new. This engine is $4,600 new, but it does come with an air filter, fuel pump mount, all those things. It also comes with some cooling parts with it, about $100 worth of cooling parts. Water pump, pulley, water lines. So if you were to subtract the price of that out of this engine, like for what you get, $4,500 is like they're all the same price new. It's not until you get into the other brand KZs or the ones that are prepared like the Total Black Edition or the special edition TMs that are about $1,000 more, which you'll see this engine be a higher price. But for the guys watching this video, like if you're just getting out there starting into the sport, you don't need that for this engine. You just go buy a standard R2. If this is the engine of choice that you end up going with, then do not go for those. You just buy a standard edition and go make laps. So anyway, all the same price new is what I'm getting at. Now let's talk used. The Honda used is by far the least expensive. I've seen stuff from $500 to $800. Stuff that is maybe blueprinted or less time on it, a fresher piece, $1,000, $1,200 really at the most. Most I ever see the Hondas go for. The Yamaha is so new. Factory Karts is the one putting that together out in California. There's not used stuff out there for sale yet, so I couldn't tell you the used price on the Yamaha. This is probably the most attractively used price engine. I've seen go for $1,500 to $225. If it's blueprinted and it's fresh, $25 to $3, maybe a really nice, it's got a good cylinder on it, a little bit more than $3 for this engine. And that's kind of similar for the 175, $1,500 to $25 used. If it's a really nice fresh piece, $3 grand. This particular, the KZs, for whatever reason, they end up being more expensive used, which I don't quite understand, because this is the engine that times out the fastest on the crank life. So a buyer buying this used takes the most risk off what they're being told, if it's true or not, how much time is on the crank. So in theory it should be cheap too, but it's not. For whatever reason, even one homologation old KZTM engines still going $3,500, $38,000, $4 grand. I don't quite understand it, but that's just the way it is. Next thing we're going to talk about is the maintenance for the kind of the recurring things on these. First thing being pistons. For all the 125s, it's relatively the same. Do note that on the Japanese stuff and the KZs, they have a Nikasil coating, which is extremely durable coating, unless you grenade one of the needle cages and suck the needles up into the transfer ports and into the cylinder and gouge the Nikasil coating. You'll have to have that replated. But other than that, the coating is extremely durable. It's a major plus to those two engine platforms. And so you won't see having to do a whole lot honing from changing pistons. You can run just a ball hone through it. And as long as everything's still square, which most of the times, 9 times out of 10 they are, putting a new piston in these is relatively simple. And anywhere from 10 to 15 hours, if your builder knows what they're doing, is fine for practice. Keep in mind that the whole light in which this video is made is for the guy that's going to be out there practicing. He's going to be rich, maybe 10 to 15 jet points higher on the main jet, just out there learning, making laps. Note that on this engine, you might not get 10 to 15 hours if the guy putting the top end together doesn't necessarily know the intricacies to the cylinder. There's some things that you got to do when honing this cylinder to be able to get a little more life out of it. On the exhaust port bridges, it seems to want to crunch the ringland if your builder doesn't do a few things to try to correct that. Also know that these two engines are iron liner cylinders, and that the Vortex ROK product has a softer liner than the IAME product. I'm not sure the reason why, if there's a reason for that, if it's just a quality deal, but it's throughout the entire lineup, from the VLR 100cc to the ROK GP to the ROK shifter. The crosshatch wears out faster than it does on the IAME product. Significantly, I would say. So on this particular engine, maybe you don't get 10 to 15 like you do practicing on these others. Perhaps be a little more conservative. Don't run it to maybe 8 to 10 is where I would put a piston in this, running it rich. And then on this one, 10 to 15 I think is safe running it rich. On this one, boy, this is probably the best thing about this engine is the top end life. You can run 25 to 30 hours practice on these. And now keep in mind, when you start to be real competitive and you're going to be chasing podiums at a regional, national level, the jetting is going to come way down. And these live and die by the jetting. The leaner it is, the less fuel and oil there is to lubricate things. So, of course, when you show up to a national race, you're going to put a fresh piston in it before every weekend anyway. But let's say you're just going to race more regional stuff and you want like good, fresh pop for the race. 3, 4, 5 hours is all you really want to put on 125s, maybe 10 to 15 the most on the 175. And when it comes to crank life, the similar dynamic between rich and getting a lot of life and landing it down for racing is going to apply to the crank life too. On these, running them rich, 100 hours is not all that uncommon, more than 100 hours running these rich. This one, 50 or so is about what you'll get. Practice rich, this one, it's turning higher RPM. That's kind of the beauty of the RPM, or should I say the crank life of this engine, is that it only turns upper 12,000s. This turns a little more than 1,000 RPM, and then this one another 1,000 more than this one. And that's kind of not only with the jetting, but the RPMs are the two major factors of crank life. So, 20 to 25 hours racing on this one when you lean it out, 45, 50 rich. And then this one, rich, you can only get maybe 25 hours out of this practice. When you bring the jetting down for racing, 10 to 15 is really the most you can expect out of it. Most people are going to be splitting the cases and taking rebuilding the crank every 10 hours, racing it really competitively. But do know that if you're just the guy that's out there having fun, bringing the jetting down to chase those last few tenths is probably not going to net you much if you're 10 to 15 seconds off the leaders at the end of a 15, 16 lap main race. So keep that in mind too, that bringing the jetting way down like that isn't for everyone. It's only really for those top level of guys. And the rest of the guys, especially the guys you're going to be racing around to, they're probably going to be of that same mindset, running it rich. And that particular condition isn't necessarily applicable to everyone that is going to get into shifter karting. I would say 50, 60, 70, I don't know, maybe even close to 80% of owners who own shifter karts are never going to really get to that level to where they need to bring the jetting down. So anyway, keep that in mind. And then crank life, we didn't get to that on this one. Racing, 25 or so is really all you want to put on these before they seize up. And practice conditions, rich, 55, 50, 60, somewhere there is where you want to put a crank in that one as well. Note that the TM KZ is the only KZ that has a 22 millimeter crank pin, so it's got a meteor bearing of the KZs. This has a 22 as well. This has a 20, and all the other KZs have a 20 millimeter crank pin, and the Yamaha engines have a 22. On read life, I want to touch on that thing. That's kind of the last maintenance item, consumable. For KZ, the reeds that come with them, as well as the 175, they are thinner, lighter reeds, and you go through them quite often. We do have a new reed designed for, well, it can be used for both of them, that we'll get at least 10 hours out of. The ROK reed is good too. The stock ROK reed has some resin impregnation inconsistencies. Sometimes the bare carbon is exposed, but it's a decent reed as well. Maybe not quite as durable as the aftermarket stuff that we have for these, but you can use that same aftermarket reed in these. And of course, the Japanese stuff, the reeds are excellent. They'll last a very long time in those. So just know that if you put stock reeds in these two engines, you're going to blow through them fast, 30 minutes or so. You need to replace the bottom reed mainly. Something else to be aware of. There's a fix for it though. Now let's talk about parts cost. The Honda, of course, the reason why we don't race it anymore or have big classes for it anymore in the United States is the parts have stopped production in the USA, most of them at least. If you need case halves, so if you sling a chain, mess up the left side case half, or if you have gearbox issues and you need some gears, you can't get them. So you have to buy a donor motor to rot parts off for these. Unfortunately, the Yamaha is a new deal. It's still in production. They remade that engine in 2022. The parts are readily available in any parts house all throughout the world. That's the biggest plus to the Yamaha, is that parts are cheap and readily available. I think a rod kit for the Yamaha is something like 70 bucks. And it's $400 for this engine, close to $300 or $400 for this engine, and maybe $250 for this engine for a rod kit. So parts are incredibly cheap in comparison. When it comes to parts on this engine, this is a Tony KART product, so just like all other Tony KART products, it's a little bit higher. Although comparatively to the IME, it's not far off. They're really close in parts. Do know that this engine has some little nuances. Pre-selector, some of the clutch parts, the head, the cylinder, some of those things you might need to replace every now and then. It's a little higher maintenance in the incidental parts for this engine. This engine doesn't have the little incidentals. Man, the gearbox is the best made gearbox karting has ever seen. It shifts like I say it's the Swiss watch of gearboxes. You can shift it with your pinky. These two engines require definitely more of a yank. That's why we extend the J-arms more, to give us a little more leverage. But and this engine is a really well-built engine, other than just having to go through cranks and pistons more often. So keep that in mind if you're specifically debating these two engines. Although this engine you may get more crank life out of, you're going to have more money in other parts too. So at the end of the day, if you had a running cost throughout what it costs you to run this engine over a few years, you may find these two are not far off each other. Especially if you take this engine apart yourself and you just send the crank off to have it rebuilt, so you do most of the work yourself, you'll find this engine might end up being cheaper than this engine. And then we're going to move on to parts on this one, which, like I said earlier, they're pretty close to this one. It doesn't have very many incidentals. The clutch inner basket you may change every 50, 60 hours, but other than that, it's got a really robust gearbox. The gearbox doesn't shift quite as well as the TM, mainly because of the additional weight of the piston. It's a 10 millimeter bigger piston, and it weighs quite a bit more. And every time you shift, the RPMs have to drop 2,000 RPMs. That's quite an abrupt change in the rotational inertia. So that's the reason why when you pull on the gear lever on this one, it takes a little bit more of a deliberate let off of the throttle, and a little bit more deliberate and perfectly timed yank than it does on this engine. And I want to read one more thing on the TM. Specifically the TM, the parts cost compared to the other Italian engines are, I think, by far the least expensive too. Not only was I saying that you're going to have more incidentals with this engine, but not only that, but just the parts in general, like pistons and cranks, like rod kits, they're just cheaper on this engine by a lot. I think you can find pistons for these for 60 bucks or so. That's more than half the price of these. Rod kit is 200, 250. These are 400. So give you an idea, parts are cheap and possibly more readily available. This is a worldwide recognized platform, which has, that's a big bonus to KZ. So anyway, I think that touches enough on the parts cost. Let's talk about driving them. In the last 5 years, since we went away from the Japanese stuff and we went to the high horsepower Italian stuff, I think we've left out a large part of the market. The guy that's out of college, got a stable job, finally has some discretionary spending, some disposable income, and wants to do karting. And maybe he has some type of motorsports background, or maybe he grew up karting and doing single speed stuff, and he wants to do shifting. Like maybe he came from dirt bikes or off-roading, and he goes to the track and he just wants to race shifter. You can't sell him a tag, period, no matter how much cheaper it is. The way that the market has gone towards this, I think it's too physical and too violent for the dude that's got, you know, a 40, 50 hour a week job and a little overweight, you know, starting a family. He's not as in shape as he was when he was a teenager racing go-karts. The jump in physicality from this to this is quite large, and especially the higher horsepower stuff. And I think we've really left out a big part of the market. And you think of how many people there are in the world, how many potential customers we have from age, you know, after you're out of college and you're stable, the mid to late 20s till 55, 60 years old, till you're just too old to do this. That's a large amount of people, like males in that age. I'd say there's 3 to 4 times the amount of potential customers in that than there are in kids age 14 to 18 racing these. So that's where this really shined. 35, stock, maybe not tuned the best, 32, 33 horsepower. The very best ones maybe made 37. Torquey, it's not a real neck snapper. This appealed to a lot of people. Very drivable. And the next step up, this is made low 40s horsepower, 41, 42. More drivable than its counterparts here if it's tuned right. This engine has to be leaned out to get it to run more driver friendly. It has a pipe on it that is its restrictor to make it, it's a detuned KZ is what it is. This is a KZ from 2011, 2012, somewhere in there. That's been detuned with a longer and narrower pipe. And it picks up a pipiness under rich jetting conditions. So like a slow corner, second to third gear, it has a spit and sputter. And once it cleans up, it just kind of takes off, and it's lurchy. And it's not a very desirable characteristic for driving these. So know that if you're going to run this rich, this engine has a pipiness that if you're on a tighter track, you're not going to like it. If you're on a longer track where you don't encounter those conditions, it'll probably be all right. And if you add a tighter track and you just keep it lean to where the pipe is always hot and you kind of tune out that pipiness. And the reason why we lean these out is the hotter the pipe gets, the higher the RPM and its effective range works. And there's just a weird tuning characteristic of this pipe, and it's the silencer too. There's not enough back pressure in the silencer, and that's where this pipiness comes from. So anyway, know that if you lay it out on a tighter track, it's fine. If you leave it rich on a tighter track, you're not going to like that pipiness. If it's a larger track, you won't notice it much either. Now, going up in power and drivability we're up to high 40s, 48 or so horsepower, and the power on this is super broad. It's got so much overrev. It revs to up into the 15.3 or so. It's an incredibly fun engine to drive. When it comes to fun factor, this is it. This has got the most wow fun, and it's got rich to rich conditions. I think this engine is easier to drive because of that pipiness I was describing earlier. But it's also a lot. Like if it's a tight track, this is a lot to pilot. But it's cool. Like it's TM, it's sexy. KZ has got this sexiness to it. It sounds fantastic. It's fun to drive. If you can pilot it and you can afford it, this is the answer. And we'll move up to this. This also makes similar power, especially with the 22 and previous rules. The carburetor that came on it was terrible. This Tillotson that came on it made it the absolute worst to drive engine of any engine that's ever been on a shifter kart ever. Incredibly lurchy, hard to tune here. You could get lost in this infinite amount of adjustability here. We didn't have the right reeds in it, and the ignition timing we hadn't quite figured out where it made it easier to drive. We've been playing with the squish and the cylinder height and the exhaust pacer and the header, a few other things. And from where these engines ran in 2019, which no one liked, everyone hated it, to how we have them tuned now with the DeLorto carburetor, they're totally different engines. This engine went from the worst engine to drive to being not far off drivability to KZ or even the Japanese stuff. So just know that this engine can be an absolute tractor. So easy to drive. You can leave it in a gear high in some corners and it'll pull it. But at the same time, if you just buy a used engine from someone that's still got all the 2019 stuff on and you go slap on a KART, you're going to hate it. So, you know, the reeds was a big part of that too. I don't know if I mentioned that already, but just know that this engine has a very broad range of opinions, or should I say, well, that too, but of drivability. Next category we're going to talk about is where to race them and kind of the racing nuances. The thing about this engine is most clubs that run all these together, this runs around 385, 390. They go up 15 pounds for these two engines to make them equal, and then down another 10 or 15 from this one to this one. And most people can't make that weight. A young kid might be able to, but that's the biggest issue with this is to make all these run together. This has to be so light, most people can't make weight. If you can, it might be an excellent, excellent engine for you if you're more budget-minded. If you're racing in Texas and you have these two engines to choose from, they don't allow this one, they don't allow this engine. At longer tracks, I would go for this engine, like Amarillo and KART MOTO. If you're going to go to the other tighter tracks at 15 pounds, I might go for this engine. If you're in the Pacific Northwest, they only run this stuff racing. So, like, if you're going to race, then this is your only choice. If you're Southwest, Arizona, Southern California, and we run all three, like I said before, it depends on your weight. Like, if you can make weight for this and they give you 10, 15 pounds, or this, and you can pick this up used cheap enough, then you might go for this. If you're heavier, then you only really have one choice. Same thing in the Midwest. When you run all three together, it's kind of based off how much you weigh. If you're a heavier guy, you may only have these choices. If you're in Utah or Sonoma, you only have ROK shifter. That's what they run there for club racing. If you're in Florida, you're probably going to run one of these. ROK has a presence there, and then they have the KZ presence there as well. Now, if you're not going to race kind of that regional, local stuff, and you're just like a hobbyist, you want to go out and make laps, there's nothing more reliable than this. If there's a lot of other guys at your local track and you're heavier and you want to be able to kind of keep up, this is the next best thing in reliability with the right tuning parts, with the right modern stuff on it. So if you're going to race at the highest level nationally, then you're probably not watching this video anyway, but you're going to probably have two of these, one to practice, one to race with, maybe even three, one to practice and two to race with. Same thing with these. You might show up to a weekend with two or three of these engines. That's just the nature of racing these at the highest level. If you're a road racer and your rules are tight and they have like a specific 125 class, running KC is your only option. If they're a little looser on the rules and it's kind of like a run what you run, then the 175 is a monster for road racing. Bigger tracks, the 175, if they allow you to play with the cylinder and all the other things, this is the way to go with for road racing. And for myself, I want to explain my view as a guy in his mid-30s. I'm in Arizona. We run all the engines here. In Colorado, they run all the engines. In Southern California, I think they're going to be planning to run all the engines. I can make weight for, I probably couldn't make weight for the Yamaha or the Honda. But I want something, I'm competitive, I'm a good driver, and I have money. I mean, I could go race this. I build engines. It wouldn't be a big deal to race these, but I like to be able to show up on an engine that's got 10, 15, 20 hours, 20, 25 hours on the crank, and go race and, not worry about being totally on top of everything. And that's where this engine has shined. Especially with the latest carburetor, putting the Delora on there. That's what I have chosen for the last 3 years. But at the same token, I think if you can find this used inexpensively, this isn't a bad choice either if you can make weight. But at the same hand, these are cheap used as well. So, and if you got lots of money, like if you're just that guy that maybe has the opinion that it's not necessarily quality or quantity in life, but quality. You just want the best experience. This is it. It's going to cost a little bit more. Maybe you have the money to do it. Maybe you're a more hands-on guy. You don't mind splitting the cases on these and rebuilding the crank more often. But this is like the nicest. This is the nicest thing karting has to offer. So more expensive, more maintenance, but if you're that guy that just wants the best and what's the best experience, quality over quantity, this is it. So the last thing I want to talk about is when you start to race these a little more competitively. I'm not going to get too much into the Honda stuff, but on these 3 engines, each has their little nuances when you start to race them. Even more so starting, if your local club's competitive, these will start to become true. Most local clubs who are competitive, I mean, you can put a good driver in any of these, and they're still going to spank the rest of the drivers. That's just the way that shifter karting is. And that's the great part about this class is it's driver focused. As long as you're making close to where you should be making on power, a good driver is still going to win. So, but as it starts to become more competitive and you have other good drivers there to race against, there's little nuances that I want to mention about each engine. This engine, because of the way the pipe and silencer is made, and it's a restricted KZ, so you do need to get the most out of this engine to be competitive against other competitive guys. So there's game in the cylinder. You want to find the shortest pipe, maybe the one with the biggest breath in the center. You want to have the silencer pack to build as much heat in the pipe as possible. You're going to fiddle with this and play with this and spend more money on this, racing it against other competitive guys. This engine, it's not a spec engine like this engine. You can take a total black engine from TM, and it's pretty good out of the box. Maybe they'll work, your engine builder may work on it a little bit, but I don't think this engine you'll spend anywhere as much as this blueprinting it and playing with it to be competitive. It makes a lot of power. I mean, the thing is with this, it makes plenty of power. Until you get to a really long track where you're really stretching out 5th and 6th gear, power discrepancies from, let's say, a standard edition R2, or maybe even a standard edition R1, which was down quite a bit from a fully prepped R1. Let's say a track like PKRA, Badger, Ocala before it closed. The discrepancies weren't that big because it was a tighter track. You really don't see those power discrepancies, even with these two at the same weight. This doesn't really start to shine until you get to the latter part of 4th gear, or maybe just 5th and 6th gear. So keep that in mind, that if you're wanting to race, if you're a competitive kid and you're thinking about racing these, and you really don't want to get into all the things that you might have experienced with tag blueprinting engines, man, the FIA stuff, KZ, you just don't deal with that. You buy a total black engine, or maybe you buy a standard edition, and your builder makes it like the best. Like, he knows exactly what to cut on, where to cut, how to prepare the carburetor, how to prepare the cases, everything. And for less than what it costs to fully mess with one of these, you have a piece that is just as good as the guy that has the best piece. So, and this is where the same kind of ways that this engine shines, but in a different context, this engine shines as well. It makes a lot of power and a lot of grunt, sometimes too much for certain tracks. But it was designed to where you could take a box stock engine and it makes enough power just out of the box. And it achieved that. Part of the problem is its drivability. Like it can be too lurchy if it's not tuned right. And but anyway, this engine, if you want something just box stock, like you don't even want, even like this one, you still ought to, if you're going to race it at the highest level, you're still going to prepare this one properly. You could take a box stock one of these and go race it at the highest level, and you'll make enough power. That was the beauty of why, and the things, the reasons behind this engine. Unfortunately, it didn't really take off. This does not have a place to race other than Master Shifter. It's been taken out of USPKS and SCUSA for the Senior Pro Shifter. But if this idea suits you well, then that's a great engine for that purpose. So anyway, I think I covered everything I wanted to cover. If you have any questions, leave them in the comments. And as always, we hope to see you at the track.